Well, first, let me just express my gratitude to the members of our caucus as well as the NDP for the support and the confirmation of the declaration of the Emergencies Act. I also want to thank the interim leader of the Green Party and Liz May, who voted in support as well. Anytime you have to declare a national emergency, it's a very sober and serious moment. The government at every juncture within this crisis has done everything that we can to provide law enforcement the tools that were necessary to restore public safety and public order. When those existing tools were not sufficient to deal with the crisis, we turned to the Emergencies Act. But we did it in a very careful and a thoughtful and a deliberate manner. And the way in which the Emergencies Act has been utilized by law enforcement is with great restraint and responsibility. We're going to continue to work very closely with provincial and territorial partners, local leaders, and of course our law enforcement so that we can sunset this law as quickly as possible. We are staying in very much close contact with them, but this is an important moment, and it demonstrates as well that Parliament works. The debate that has occurred over the last number of days has shed light on why it is that this law was written in the first place, which was to deal with moments like this where we find ourselves in a national emergency, to carefully circumscribe those powers which are necessary to give to law enforcement to address that emergency, but to do it in a way that is consistent with the Charter, to do it in a way that is consistent with all of the individual rights, principles, and values, and yes, freedoms as well, so that we can obviously get back to life as normal. It's been a very challenging moment. I think we know that, but I also want to make sure that I allow my colleague and my friend, Minister Blair, the Minister for Emergency Preparedness, say a few words as well.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I would just like the opportunity, if I may, just to explain to Canadians why we felt this was so necessary. We saw the impact of the illegal blockades on the people of Ottawa, where their lives and their communities were terribly interrupted and impacted by frankly, the unlawful activities of people. And while we will always defend people's right to opinion, expression, and assembly, there are limits to rights when they begin to impact so severely on the rights of others. And we saw that here in Ottawa. We also watched with growing concern as part of this protest group started targeting critical infrastructure in this country when they went to the border at Windsor, when they blockaded at Coutts, Alberta, and Emerson, Manitoba. They were going, frankly, for the lifeblood of this nation, which is trade with the United States, and the movement of goods and services. Their clear intent was to hurt the country and hurt Canadians. And so I think very clearly it was in fact an emergency. I want to also assure Canadians that we looked very carefully at what authorities, our law enforcement officials and other officials would have to have in order to address this emergency and render the situation safe yet again. And we have seen that those tools that we provided to law enforcement and other officials have been used very responsibly, in full knowledge that their efforts and their work must at all times be Charter compliant. And we witnessed over the past few days the police operation in the city of Ottawa, which has helped to restore the peace and tranquility of this community. Finally, I would also like to assure Canadians that we said we will do what is required and only as long as it's required. And we are in hourly consultation with our officials about the threat that exists and has existed and continues to exist in this country. And we undertake that as soon as it's no longer required, we are prepared to lift those measures. But that decision will be based on the objective advice that we receive from law enforcement and from our officials and from communities and Canadians right across the country who have been so severely impacted by the actions of these illegal protests.
On that note, can you clarify on timing? There's some confusion from the press conference this morning that there's a suggestion that it could go for 3 months. Can you please just clarify what timing you're looking at for this act? Is 3 months a possibility?
Well, first let's go back to what the law says. Law says that the government can invoke the Emergencies Act for a period of 7 days, at which point there needs to be a vote to determine whether or not it can be extended for the 30-day period from the date of invocation. So what you saw tonight was the House of Commons voting to confirm the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. Our sincere intent is to remain in very close contact with law enforcement. As Minister Blair said, we are staying in touch with them on virtually an hourly basis and around the clock. And that as we are getting advice from them about the ability to restore public order, not only here in Ottawa, but to keep important and essential trade corridors open at our official ports, we will take that advice under very careful consideration so that as soon as possible, and not a minute longer, we will be in a position to sunset the Emergencies Act.
That doesn't clarify any of my questions.
Well,
Minister,
Monica, if I may?
I understand the law, I understand.
The law is very clear.
I know.
It is for 30 days, and then if we
I know,
have to
and
expand
I've read
beyond it.
that, but there's confusion from the press conference this morning. I believe you were asked, or somebody was asked, if it could go for 3 months.
Well, and if I may provide clarification, the act that was invoked on the 15th of February allowed for the measures to remain in place, subject to the vote that we've just had tonight, subject to parliamentary committee oversight and review, subject to a vote in the other place, in the Senate as well, which I understand the debate and vote will take place this week, for up to 30 days. But we have also said right from the outset, we will only do this as long as we believe it is required. And so we are very hopeful that our law enforcement officials and other officials across the country will be able to restore the peace and the rule of law right across the country and end the state of emergency as quickly as possible.
Mais vous dites justement jusqu'à 30 jours. Le Sénat va commencer à en débattre demain. Aujourd'hui, on est au jour 8. Est-ce qu'on pourrait retirer la loi sur les mesures d'urgence avant le 30 jours? Vous pourriez dire au Sénat, on en a besoin? Oui,
ça c'est possible. Et si on va rester en contact avec les forces policières qui donnaient le conseil, leur avis de la nécessité de la loi des mesures d'urgence. C'est un exercice qui nous continuons de suivre chaque heure, chaque jour, chaque semaine. Et si nous sommes dans une situation où il n'y a aucune des circonstances pour le test dans la loi, on va retirer la loi.
OK. Puis, à l'inverse, quelles sont les chances qu'on aille au-delà des 30 jours?
Mais il y a beaucoup de progrès pendant les dernières quelques journées. Et une des raisons est parce que le gouvernement a fait le choix difficile, dur, d'invoquer la loi de mesures d'urgence. C'est les forces policières qui nous expliquent qu'ils ont besoin des outils, des nouveaux outils pour adresser les blocages illégaux. Mais malgré les progrès, il y a quelques risques qui restent encore, mais on continue de rester en contact avec les forces policières. Et si c'est possible de retirer la loi, on va suivre aussitôt que possible.
Why wasn't this a confidence vote?
Well, look, I mean, just on that point, I think the Prime Minister spoke very clearly that anyone who voted against the government was clearly expressing that they did not have confidence in the government's decisions and choices around national security, and particularly around the national state of emergency which existed as a result of the emergency. And so clearly for those that made that difficult choice to vote against the government, I think they've spoken with their voice. On the other hand, I was very pleased to see that we were able to build a consensus with the NDP, with Liz May from the Green Party. And frankly, not just here in this chamber, but when you survey the entire country, what you see is support across political stripes from the NDP in British Columbia at the provincial level, here in Ontario from Premier Doug Ford, the Conservative level, and frankly, across police services at every level. We had the letter from the Canadian Association of the Chiefs of Police, the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police, the Canadian Association of Police, which represents the rank and file members. These are nonpartisan individuals who exercise their responsibilities and their duties in a very professional manner, as we saw in Ottawa over the course of the last number of days. And with that consensus, we feel that this was a necessary choice. But make no mistake, we have every hope and intention to withdraw the Emergencies Act as quickly as we can.
Did you tell members of the Liberal Party that this was a confidence vote?
I think,
That's what Nate is saying.
well, I think from the Prime Minister's comments this morning and anybody who was making the choice as to which way they were voting tonight, that they would understand that a vote against would be obviously a clear representation, a clear statement that they did not have confidence in the government.
So they were threatened for being expelled from the Liberal caucus? That's what that seems to be saying.
Yeah.
Just a clear yes or no would be great.
No, no one was threatened with expulsion. This was an important vote. And I believe that overwhelmingly our caucus and other parliamentary colleagues understood the importance of this vote and the affirmation that the Emergency Act was in fact necessary and appropriately applied. And so that vote took place, and frankly, the question of individuals' reasons for voting, frankly, are now moot, in my opinion. The vote passed, and we will proceed.
Monsieur Mendicino,
Dernière question en français.
j'aimerais clarifier une chose. Monsieur le maire Watson a déclaré il y a quelques jours qu'il pourrait vendre des véhicules qui ont été saisis pour utiliser cet argent-là, payer la facture pour la ville. Est-ce qu'il en a le pouvoir grâce à la loi sur les mesures d'urgence?
Mais la façon que la loi fonctionne, et nous avons créé les lois, les politiques dans la déclaration, par exemple, la loi pour arrêter les contributions financières, pour saisir les financements qui avaient en relation avec le blocage illégal. Mais l'opéralisation, l'implémentation de cette loi est une décision pour les forces policières. Partout, il faut respecter la loi, il faut respecter la charte, même les protections dans l'article 8 de la charte. Et sur les questions techniques, sur qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire avec les propriétaires et les autos, par exemple, c'est une question pour les forces policières.
Can you just clarify on spending on costs? The city of Ottawa seemed to suggest that the federal government would pay for all the RCMP's costs. Can you clarify if that's the case?
No, that is a good question, and there are funds which the City of Ottawa can apply to offset those additional expenses which have been accumulated as a result of the now very significant expenditures that have been necessary to restore public safety here in Ottawa. I've had some conversations with Mayor Watson about that, and certainly will continue to have those going forward. So.
Okay, but what does that mean? The city said that the RCMP wasn't billing it for its services. Are you saying that could still change and they might get a bill from the RCMP?
I think the bottom line is we're going to work very closely with the City of Ottawa to try and support them in offsetting their costs, not only when it comes to law enforcement, but you heard the additional funds that were introduced to help small businesses. We've been there for Canadians. We've been there for cities throughout the pandemic. We're going to continue to be there for the City of Ottawa in the wake of the illegal occupation here.
Thank you, Mr.
Merci.
President.